Ed, and then we'll go to Catherine after you, and then we'll come to Ruth after Catherine. So Seb Dance, as I'm sure you all know, is a former MEP for London, maybe future MEP for London as well, let's find out, and doing a whole host of exciting things with his life right now, which he may allude to when he speaks to us. But he was, I think, vice chair of the Environment Committee in the European Parliament when he was an MEP, and is now, doing other things, both in Europe and in the UK as well, I know. So Seb, please talk to us about the future relationship, and then that obviously in the context of food, environment and climate, and then we'll move on. So thank you, go ahead.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for having me, everyone. And yes, I was a vice chair of the Environment Committee for about 7 months, but yeah, member of the committee for the whole of my time in the Parliament, which was considerably longer than 5 months, though not as long I see as others here. Richard is here. Hello, Richard, good to see you. Others obviously have served a lot longer, and I think I saw Jackie as well. Forgive me because I can't see everyone in front of me, and I haven't. If I enlarge it, I'm sure I saw Jackie. But anyway, welcome to. There she is. Hello, nice to see you. My wonderful former colleagues in the EPLP. And yes, I mean, gosh, there's so much to unpack at the moment, isn't there? So let's start, I suppose, with the current situation that we're in and the context, obviously, of where we're at. It is important, I think, to say two things. The first is that it is perfectly fine and possible to say that the NHS and the machinery of government that we have in this country have done an excellent, excellent job in the rollout of the vaccine and ensuring that as many people as possible receive what is an essential part of the strategy for really getting us out of this mess. It's also possible to say and be disappointed with the level of rollout across the European Union. I don't think that there was anything wrong with the idea of ensuring that every country progresses at the same rate, but clearly there have been mistakes that have been made in the procurement. And that is not an issue that the Commission has shone with any particular brilliance on. And of course, there have been a series of mishaps, not least the Article 16 accidental triggering and then withdrawal, which took about 6 hours, but caused a huge amount of damage to the prestige of the Commission, and of course did a huge amount of damage to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So there will be huge ramifications for all of that. It's perfectly possible to recognise both of those things, but also to still believe that Brexit is fundamentally a terrible, terrible, terrible idea, and that you can have good initiatives, you can have bad initiatives, you can have good commissions, you can have bad commissions, just as you can have episodes, even when we're in power, when things go wrong. And of course, it is perfectly right and proper that we acknowledge where things go right, and also feel free to criticize where things go wrong. But it's understandable that this week, obviously, we have seen pro-Europeans being really on the back foot. And I think what's really interesting about the way in which the government is proceeding, because I know one of the things you wanted me to talk about was the future relationship, as in what does the relationship look like between the UK and the EU. One of the key things, obviously, that the government is really want to do is to seize on any opportunity it possibly can to cast Britain as doing better than the EU, whilst of course ignoring the multitude of things that have been going wrong. We don't need to spend too long on describing what's gone wrong, but I mean, taking a look at, for example, in the fishing industry, where in Scotland in particular, there have been huge problems. Companies have gone bust already as a result of their catch effectively being unsellable to the market that they once had unfettered access to. Of course, it doesn't matter how much fish you catch if you can't actually sell the stuff, and that is, of course, a huge issue for fishing communities. But it's across the board, from supermarkets through to basically anyone who deals in the export of goods, because, of course, what we were promised with frictionless trade and all the rest of it simply hasn't happened. That will become far more apparent, I think, as we go forward with services. So there will be many, many different problems, and it's up to all of us to talk to our communities, to talk to our businesses, to work out exactly where those problems are and to make note of them, because we cannot let the government off the hook on this. There will be a huge aggregate drag on the UK economy, and it remains a simple fact that as long as you have a developed, educated population in a developed democracy, as we are, you can't simply ignore decline. You can't simply ignore embedded disadvantages that that Brits will have that our near neighbours won't, and that means that this issue of Brexit obviously will not go away. So that's all I wanted to say, just about the bigger picture, and to say that obviously the government is still fighting that propaganda war and will be fighting that propaganda war for some time. It needs to justify Brexit, both to the population at large, but also, of course, to its own base, and that means that we will get much more of this, and it means that the relationship between the UK and the EU will be that much more fraught as a result. What does this mean in the context of environment and climate change? I mean, the first thing to say is that the EU is is one of the big players, obviously, when it comes to the forthcoming COP conference in Glasgow. And when I say one of the big players, what I really mean is, of course, it's one of the three big players. There are three major emitters in the world: the US, China, and the European Union. And it is these three economic blocs that will largely decide the direction of travel in the talks. I remember very keenly, I was on the delegation to the Paris talks, where the commissioner at the time was Cañete, Spanish commissioner, an incredibly energetic person who doesn't come from our political family, but nonetheless tackles his task at hand with a high degree of veracity and energy. And I remember very clearly him running backwards and forwards between the individual delegations from EU member states, including our own, collating a kind of collective position, and then running with his officials all the way down the corridor to the Chinese delegation or the US delegation, and really being at the heart of thrashing out a global deal. And that, of course, will be the case in Glasgow. Now, there is obviously an opportunity, a unique opportunity, really, for the UK to input itself into this process, but we also have to recognize what our limitations are, and that is we are no longer part of that big three. The real only way we will be taken seriously by our European colleagues is, of course, not to engage in a race to the bottom on standards, to somehow believe that we can outcompete our near neighbours by reducing our environmental standards, of being laxer on targets and so on. We have actually an opportunity, dare I say it, to try and embarrass the European Union into being more ambitious, into being stronger. That is an opportunity that we should be taking, not in the spirit of trying to rubbish what the EU is doing, because ultimately we need them to be successful. They are the ones that will muster the support and have the economies of scale that we simply don't have. It would be preferable to be in the EU delegation, but as we're not, we should be the ones really pushing them for the highest, the most ambitious targets possible. And we should be doing that by also stressing the need to link climate to diplomacy, to trade as well. These things cannot be treated as independent and separate work strands. They are inextricably linked. And by that, of course, I mean that when there are discussions on the table, as there are at the moment, between the Commission and the Chinese government on potential trade issues, when there are discussions between the US and the Commission on potential trade issues, then it is absolutely essential that climate is part of that. We always talk about human rights, rightly. We always talk about human rights being a component of our trade policy, but so, of course, must climate. Now, we have at the moment this rather awkward position where the Commission is kind of forgetting the human rights element, but concentrating on the climate aspect. And the incoming US administration is concentrating on the human rights aspect, but perhaps ignoring some of the climate issues. Now, it's you can't play it both ways. You have to have a robust policy on both of these issues, but it is essential that we don't kind of pigeonhole climate into something that has to be discussed after everything else has been sorted. It has to be part and parcel of those big discussions and the points of leverage that the European Union has. Just very quickly, I mean, there's a whole series of issues that we could talk about when it comes to climate. Obviously, we can talk about the macro, as I have been, when it comes to target setting for CO2. We can talk about individual legislation on car emissions and the policies that local authorities can have to green their neighborhoods and improve electric mobility and so on and so forth. But I mean, fundamentally, it all boils down to this one point, which is that we cannot possibly succeed in our local communities and in our country as a whole if we decide that we are going to significantly diverge from the standards that are being set across the channel. We must always bear in mind that those are the minimum standards, by the way. They are the minimum common standards that would be adopted by all member states. So we should be, we should at every single juncture and opportunity be the voice that is calling for more ambition and actually be the one setting examples locally. We're not in power nationally, but we are in power across many parts of the country when it comes to councils and national assemblies and so on. This is where we really can prove a difference and show what a Labour governments and Labour administration can do. And by the way, that will then improve immeasurably the other aspects of the relationship, some of which I talked about at the beginning, the kind of antagonism that we're seeing from this government, because it has to justify their, what I called earlier, an asinine project. They have to justify Brexit at every opportunity. We don't have to fall into that trap at all. We can attack the government on the specifics of where they are failing on Brexit, and we can be good friends and partners to the EU going forward as well. That's really what I wanted to say. I mean, I know that there will be lots of kind of desire to talk about other aspects of our relationship with the EU, but I think when it comes to the environment, I think that's really an overview of what I think our focus should be right now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Seb. Concise and thoughtful as always. So thank you so much for that. Catherine, we'll come straight across to you. So Catherine West, MP, as you all know, is our Shadow Minister for Europe and the Americas, and is doing a brilliant job in that role. And it's, I mean, just speaking personally and in a professional role, it's great to have an avowed pro-European in that role. So Catherine, it'd be great to hear from you on this subject of the future relationship, and particularly as it relates to climate, environment and food. And thank you for joining us.
And thank you, Mike, and thank you for the work that you've done patiently to arrange meetings and conversations, and right back to conference, Labour Party conference, which was the beginning of all the online discussions, just sticking with us through all of that, and you know, managing all of the conversations around the very difficult month that was December, and obviously into now where we're coming together again to talk about the important relationships, the important problem solving that we can all do together. I briefly wanted to pick up where Seb left off, which was we've got a London elections coming up, and I'm very aware that the work that Sadiq Khan has done on the ULEZ, which is a charging scheme, so started off as very unpopular, to make vehicles which come into central London much cleaner. Basically a very similar model to a lot of European cities, where cars need to, or vehicles need to come up to a certain standard, otherwise they have to pay a higher tariff to come into central London. That is obviously combined with the congestion charge, allowed Transport for London to have a little bit of leeway, and has allowed, before COVID, of course, which wrecked all the finances, but allowed us to focus in London on cycling, walking, waste, recycling, and a number of other work streams. In particular, the London boroughs have basically, since the cuts to local government, which Seb mentioned, sort of stood still on recycling, whereas you would imagine that in the last decade we would have gone streets ahead in terms of recycling, because there's been very little government investment in models which move away from, for example, incineration. We've ended up with almost standing still on our recycling rate. And when it comes to COP26 in November, it's going to be quite embarrassing when you look back, because in the end, a lot of environmental progress can be made through what you do in your everyday life, what your business does, what your workplace does. And this government has not kept up with the investment that you need in order to have those big steps forward. But in London, we are pleased that the ULEZ and the congestion charge together have reduced pollutants into the air by 44%. So just since Sadiq became the mayor, we've had a 44% increase in good quality air. And some of you might have read about the little 8-year-old girl who died quite some time ago now, but her mother has been campaigning strongly for children's health, for all those children who suffer from asthma and have to use inhalers every day. And she's very cleverly linked in that debate about how we can change the vehicles that we drive or which come into central London, linking it with that family health, because obviously it's difficult to sometimes win the argument on the environment, because people who might be on a low income and rely on an old car because they can't afford a new one, obviously this is linking in with those sorts of incentives. And, you know, we can look across to Europe for some really good examples where, you know, the cycles more or less dominate cities. And in the Netherlands, for example, it's not unusual to cycle 10 miles to work because the cycle paths are so good, and we've still all got a long, long way to go on that. On the more international piece, because I know Ruth is going to cover the Environment Bill and the bees and all the other things that we're doing nationally, part of my brief is Latin America. And one of the conversations I've been having with both trade union colleagues and with the ambassador for Brazil and with a number of others in Latin America is talking about the Amazon forests, rivers, oceans, and air, the air quality in that continent. Because if you read the analysis of the Climate Change Committee and of international experts, the importance of that whole ecosystem to the world is crucial, and we can't let the likes of Mr. Bolsonaro just dictate for this whole decade how our air quality will end up in that part of the world. So we've been challenging quite a lot in terms of the ambassador relationship around what's being done on mining and what UK companies are doing in Brazil. And obviously the UK is much smaller now than when it was in the EU. And I know that the EU, having spoken with Jude Curtin-Darling and others who were on the Trade Committee, have been very mindful about what the EU can do with its huge 500 million people market to put pressure on the likes of Brazil. Obviously with China, there is some progress there because they've announced these quite challenging targets, and they've announced that they're going to put their mind to it. But with Latin America, it's positive players like the European Union, and I would hope that the UK will follow suit, although some of the decisions that this government has made in the last few months make me doubt that. But the EU will continue to be a force for good on the environment and having an environmental chapter in trade deals. The other important thing which has come out of the whole last few months on negotiations, and I know colleagues on this call will have a more intimate depth of knowledge on this, is the question of fishing. Obviously, at the moment, it's all a question about how you get your fish to market, because we are going to lose jobs and investment because of the state of the particular Brexit deal. But within that, the question will become in the annual, when it eventually gets to the annual discussions on fishing, what will be the environmental principles which go into that? So I feel that, you know, there's a lot in that as well. And I know Richard's on the call, so he'll be able to chip in onto that particular question. Just finally, a quick reflection on the American election. Obviously, we're all like a Christmas tree hanging all our hopes for whatever it is, peace in the Middle East, you know, a great deal on climate, you know, maintaining peace in Ireland, a whole lot of things onto the Joe Biden Christmas tree. But I do feel that because he's been completely upfront about climate the whole way through his campaign, it was almost as though he thought, it's not worth getting elected if I don't talk about climate. I think that really must strengthen our arm in the Labour movement here. But I think we need to talk about it in a way which makes sense to people around jobs. So, for example, with manufacturing, what are we doing on manufacturing to ensure that there are opportunities, for example, around battery manufacturing? What are the opportunities in terms of a green manufacturing approach on things like pharmaceuticals? Because obviously there will now be a steady sector making vaccines for a start. PPE, is there anything more that can be done in terms of manufacturing on PPE and being more demanding in terms of the environmental credentials, not just of the manufacturing process, but of course of the products themselves? So there are huge questions here, and I think that's the sort of discussions that we need to talk about when we talk about the environment, so that working people who we want to vote for us at the next election can understand that we're linking the environment with jobs. And to finish where I started on the local, obviously with my background as a council leader, one of the best projects which we introduced was to basically give away more environmentally friendly boilers to the private sector. You'd all be aware that we have a growing private sector because we haven't built enough social homes. And in the private sector, if you give away green boilers which fit particular green specificities, then you're ending up with a good, solid construction industry workflow, and you can provide certainty for a number of years. And of course, that is where you're talking about construction, you're talking about apprenticeships, you're talking about jobs. And also, if you do it through local authorities, you can also ensure that as you let a contract for that, you are insisting on local employment, on a number of apprenticeships, and you're insisting on high quality and green materials. So there are a multiplicity of ways that we need to approach what is the worst recession since for several hundred years. And I was quite encouraged by Mr. Danker, who's the new CBI lead, talking about the importance of trade unions, workers, communities, government, all working together to tackle COVID, to tackle the recession, which I think is going to be awful and is awful for many of my constituents already, and also climate. So thank you, Mike, for having me tonight, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing questions, comments, ideas, so that Labor can be, coming out with some really decent policies and ideas before too long.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. Insightful as ever. Thank you so much. And then last but very much not least, we've got Ruth Jones MP joining us, who is Labour MP for Newport West and is our Shadow Minister for the Natural Environment and Air Quality. So love to hear from you, Ruth, about your thoughts on, I guess, how Brexit changes your role, and how you view your role in the future relationship in light of the role that you have and the collaboration that you will want with maybe our sister parties across the EU and Brussels itself. And then also it'd be great to hear from you about perhaps where you think the dividing lines are between us and the Conservatives in the area of your brief. And perhaps particularly thinking about air quality, because as we know, air quality's got much better in London since Sadiq was elected, but it's very bad in many communities across our country, very sadly, and that has consequences in lots of people's health, and particularly for children's health. So we'll come to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much for inviting me tonight. It's a delight to be here, and nice to see so many of you. Obviously, Catherine is here, and thank you you've just basically said everything I was going to say, so basically it's all of what you said. But also it's lovely to see Richard Corbett and of course Jackie Jones. Jackie's obviously on a West Walian beach there somewhere, so that's great. Swimming away, and and Seb, of course, as well. It's lovely to see the the MEPs who've done so much work for us, and hopefully will continue to do work for us in the future. That's brilliant. I suppose the way I would take it, we may be out of Europe, but we are still Europeans, and therefore that means our principles are based on cooperation, solidarity, and collaboration. Obviously, Tories have a different view on that, but we have to be clear, we are still internationalists, and that does mean working across borders and in partnership. You need to bear with me because obviously DEFRA is a huge brief, so I've only got a small bit of it. So I've got some sort of key headline figures from the other patches, so my apologies if I read some of it to you, but bear with me. Also, you're going to be talking about climate change, and in terms of COP26, essentially BEIS, the Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, will be taking that through. So Ed Miliband's team will be taking that through. So I assume you'll be getting them in to talk to you about climate change specifically. But in terms of where we are, so obviously last week we took the Environment Bill through the House, which was an interesting experience in COVID times, because obviously when you're not actually speaking, you have to have your mask on. And it's, you know, mask on, mask off, jumping up and down. But it was going through the report stage. Now, this is a bill which was supposed to be groundbreaking, once in a generation. It was going to be all singing, all dancing. It was first introduced in 2019 by the Tories. And then it went missing, completely missing in action. We lost it for 200 days. Nobody knew where it was, what was going on. It resurfaced, and then we took it through committee. And then we went on to, that was back in November, and then it suddenly appeared very quickly at report stage. And then they announced the day before the report came out, report stage, was that they were splitting it into two. So we were having day one last week, and we have day two in May. So that means it won't get enacted until the autumn. And the reason it's important is because of Brexit, you know, things happen, standards and regulations changed as of December 31st, 2020. So these things need to be replaced. And as yet, we don't have any replacements. We have gaping chasms really where they are or where they were. So that's one of the big issues. Obviously, you know, Catherine's mentioned fisheries and fishing. It's a massive issue at the moment. The coast is being devastated because we are supposed to be an independent coastal state in full control of our waters. Obviously, the fleet is basically tied up at the moment, unable to access the fishing quotas that were previously available to it. You know, only a few weeks ago they were out there fishing, now they can't. So that's a big issue. And it's not as if this is Brexit has happened. It's not as if the government was unaware of it. They had four and a half years to prepare for this. And as usual, we got the Brexit agreement deal to be read on Christmas Eve or maybe the 23rd, you know, and we had to get it read and sorted over Christmas. It was completely unacceptable. But you know, this is the way this government does these things. Last minute, no scrutiny, let's just bung it through. That was the way. So basically, one of the big problems we have is obviously the UK exports 80% of what it catches and imports 70% of what we eat. So if you like, you know, we need that trade at the border. It's so important. And at the moment, we've got fish that's rotting at the borders because they basically can't get through. So that's a big issue. So one of the options the fisheries people are looking at is to maybe land their catches in the EU. You know, seems reasonable, but obviously that's going to have a huge knock-on effect to jobs and coastal communities here, because obviously for every one job out at sea, there are at least 8 jobs on the land in connection with it in terms of, you know, packing and all those sorts of things. So that's a big issue. Shellfish is another issue which you may have seen hit the headlines in the last 24 hours or so. Basically, a lot of shellfish have basically rotted at the borders because, again, the processing of the purification and processing of shellfish must be done before it enters the EU market. So that's another issue that it has resulted in thousands of tons of dead stock having to be dumped because it's not been sold in time and it's now unfit for human consumption. Big issue. Things like, you wouldn't think of it, but assistance dogs, you know, guide dogs, people, you know, people who need their guide dogs or assistance dogs of whatever, will now have to meet more stringent requirements when, say, traveling to Northern Ireland. You know, you wouldn't think about that. You think, well, that's a bit odd, isn't it? But obviously, because of the border protocol, Northern Ireland is treated as if it's part of the, or it is part of the island of Ireland, and the border there, we have to make sure that the border, which is down the sea, is observed. And that means people with guide dogs have great difficulty because they will need to ensure their dog has an up-to-date rabies vaccination, obtain an animal health certificate, and administer, you know, tapeworm treatments. This is going to present a huge barrier, and you may think, oh, that's no big deal. But one of the the assistance dog owners, they have an impact, and the Guide Dogs charity have a centre in Belfast. So obviously they regularly take their dogs across from the mainland to Northern Ireland, you know, for training and whatever. That's a big issue. Food is another issue. Obviously all products and animal and plant origin heading from the UK to EU markets now need an export health certificate signed off by an authorised veterinarian. And we don't have enough vets, basically. That's going to be an issue. So there's a shortage of customs agents and vets, so that's going to be a big issue there. In terms of the actual things on the road, border traffic. So at the moment, there's not sufficient, there are not great many numbers of lorries going across. They're still getting stuck, but at the moment, there's only about a tenth of the actual traffic that could be going across, because basically lorry hauliers have basically said, do you know what, we're going to sit back and see what happens first before we actually go out there. So that's the fear. There will be a second wave of border chaos in a few weeks' time. So again, that's not good news for anybody. Obviously, we welcome the zero tariff, zero quota trade and continuity agreement. Yes, that's great. But many of the food and drink items exported to the EU will not be tariff-free because of the rules of origin. So, you know, depending on where they come from and their certification, they may end up having to pay tariffs for those as well. So that's a big issue. And obviously, the EU is our largest export market for food and drink. 60% of our sales go to the EU. And in terms of beef, that's 82% goes to the EU. Dairy is 78%, and 90% of all lamb and sheep exports go from the UK to the EU. Massive, massive area. We need to keep those borders open. Still not clear what the government's doing about that. So these are big issues. So basically, obviously, farmers are another issue, and their payments, how will they be paid? They have been paid in the past on the Common Agricultural Policy, which obviously my MEP friends know far more about than I do, so I'm not going to dream to step on their toes there. But the new land management scheme is coming in, but nobody really knows how it's going to work. The farmers are very anxious, obviously, because they're going to see their payments cut between 5 and 25% next year. And many will lose up to half of their current income within 3 years. This is a big issue for them, and they're saying, you know, they're not going to be able to survive without that. Pesticides is another area. Obviously, I'm going to, you know, the bees, the neonicotinoids are another area where obviously the sugar beet crop has been attacked by a particular blight, and obviously the pesticides the farmers want to use are the ones that kill the bees. Neonics, as I'm sure you're well aware, are the ones who actually kill the bees and other pollinators. Labour's been very strong on this. We cannot afford to kill the bees. You know, you kill the bees, you kill all sorts of pollination. We don't have any plants in the future. That's a big issue. So pollinator health is non-negotiable. And certainly last week we set an amendment before the House challenging or looking to stop the use of neonics. And what happened was that, as expected, the Tory government forced it through. But we will have another chance in May, and we will come back to that one, because obviously we understand there is a problem with the sugar beet. Yes, of course, but there's got to be a better way of dealing with it than this. So my other areas are waste and recycling. So obviously I'm going to shout for Wales here. Wales leads the way in terms of recycling in the UK. Thank you, Jackie. And we, you know, up to 65% of councils are, well, 65% of waste in councils is recyclable, and it is currently being done in Wales. We want the same systems in England. We want, you know, decent curbside recycling. We don't want to be exporting plastics or rubbish like the 21 containers that went to Sri Lanka in 2017 and were sent back to us in 2020, containing mattresses and carpets and things like that. That is not the way forward. Air quality, obviously Catherine's, you know, spoken about that, you know, and the little girl, Ella Kissy Deborah, was, she would have been 17 last week. You know, a waste of a life, but she's not the only one who's died as a result of air pollution. And again, part of the Environment Bill is all about the making sure we actually have targets to make sure the particulate matter of 2.5 and below is weeded out. So that's the important one there. The other thing then is chemicals, which I know are not particularly sexy and they don't seem very exciting to anybody, but unless we have chemical regulation, as we had when we were in the EU, with the what they call the REACH system, so regulation, it'll come to me in a minute, hang on, regulation in bear with me, but basically you register, you authorise the chemicals and you make sure that they're fit for purpose. At the moment in the EU, there's £100 million a year being spent on that, 400 staff. In the UK, the government thinks they'll probably get about 30 in, hopefully by the end of the year, and they'll be spending maybe about 20 million this year, and most of that will be spent on the IT setup, the new systems. So it's a massive area, and you think, oh, it's not important, but it is, because it's things like car manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, paint industry, all of these big areas. What we don't want is for the UK to be seen as the dirty man of Europe, and there's a danger that chemicals will be dumped on our doorstep, because we won't have the strong regulation. We've said, Labour has said all the way along, you know this, we want standards as good as the EU. It should be a ceiling, not a floor. So we want to make sure that we go forward and we build stronger and stronger, and we will be holding this government to account, but flip, it's going to be hard. And I'll stop there in case there's bound to be questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was fascinating, and it's lovely to hear from you. So do come again. So we'll move on to questions now. So if people have questions, you can do a number of things. You can write in the chat, or you can raise a hand, either ideally using the participants tab or the reactions tab, wherever it is now. And then I'll see it, and that'll be great, because I can't see all of you. So if you wave, I may well not see you. So, but to start off with, question from me for Seb. Obviously there's been the same standards, and there's been very close links in terms of climate cooperation, and indeed an energy market as well between the UK and the European Union, because we're all in the single market, and so that is no longer the case. What do you think the implications are for our climate cooperation, and also for the energy market moving forward? And if there is if there's a more distant energy market, if there are barriers in place in terms of the transfer of energy, will that have implications for our ability to develop enough clean energy in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, yes is the short answer. I mean, as with a lot of Brexit, it's really a question of whose move is next. Like, what will the UK government decide to do in terms of its priorities? So if its priorities are to have a completely independent energy strategy to effectively, and we saw, I think it was today or maybe yesterday, release of some proposals on new state aid rules and support for particular industries, some of which, I mean, I have to admit, I haven't read the exact proposal from the minister, so I'm going entirely by secondhand kind of picking things up here. But it has been suggested that this might be an opportunity for the government to subsidise new coal mines, for example. Now, I think that would be a particularly bad decision for obvious reasons, which are obvious to everyone here. But if that's the kind of direction that the government chooses, and I'm not saying that is necessarily what they're going to do, but obviously everything we know about the proponents of Brexit and the rationale they had for making the case for it, then we should at the very least be extremely concerned and worried and on guard as to the potential for them to do that. And of course, if there is divergence, if there is a race to the bottom on standards, that's really when the notion of cooperation really begins to unravel. Now, already at the moment, so we have this zero tariff, zero quota deal, which is really predicated on there being no race to the bottom on standards on a whole range of issues. So even just the very basic deal that we have at present, and we had a brilliant list of reasons from Ruth as to why that bare minimum is not anywhere near sufficient for the economy to properly function. But even that is contingent on the government not making the decision to diverge. So that really is, it's kind of our role really, is to not only warn against it, and to be on guard, but obviously to make very clear the case that we will not be diverging on a race to the bottom, but we will be pushing for the very highest standards at every level. And it's really encouraging to hear from Catherine that the range of potential Labour policies, drawing of course on our experience in local government and city government and as we've said, national government as well in Wales, that is how we, that's how we intend to proceed. And there will be a choice that the British people will make at some point between two very different versions of what our future looks like, and the Labour version has to be in cohort really with our European neighbours. Now, I have my own views, as many of you know, as to where that could and should eventually lead. But the environment is a really clear example of how that cooperation is essential. And that divergence does, of course, put under threat many of the benefits that we have, including, as you say, the single energy market that we were once part of.
Great, thank you. Catherine, question for you, which may put you on the spot slightly, so if it does, then apologies. At the end of December, when the deal was announced, Labour put forward a number of amendments and made very clear in its response to the deal that the deal wasn't adequate, and the government had done a bad job in negotiating the Brexit outcome. And yet, more recently, Keir Starmer was quoted as saying that he didn't plan to change the deal when we came into government in 2024. So those seem to be two different things to me, to some degree opposed to one another. So just be good to hear from you on your view on that, and also how you think Labour policy is likely to develop as it comes to the deal. And I do understand the sensitivities that Keir was in a way speaking to, but nevertheless, I think we in the party, and I'm sure Keir as well, knows that it's a bad deal and it will need to be improved at some point.
I think the point of voting in favour of what we're calling the treaty, because it's a new treaty, is just that this is very much a beginning, and that it represents a number of areas which need desperate improvement. I mean, we can already see that with the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And today, I mean, for the last 2 days, we have seen peace in Northern Ireland severely at risk. And to me, this goes to the heart of why Brexit is so problematic. And, I think Seb's been saying it till he's red in the face for the last few years, and so have we all. But nevertheless, it did eventually wind its way through. So I think there will have to be changes, because this is the first time any country has stepped back from the EU. Most countries are desperately trying to gain access to the EU membership. So I think that there will be revisions. I think that the journalist was probably really asking, are you immediately going to go back into the European Union? And I think Keir was ruling out an immediately restarting of a debate about membership. That's, I think, what he meant when he gave that interview. But I think the first thing to do is to protect peace in Northern Ireland. So in terms of where Labour goes from here, we have to be helpful. And I know that Louise Haigh had an urgent question yesterday in the House. In my ambassador meetings, I had a number of partners in the last 48 hours I've spoken to who are very worried about their businesses. We all know that there are certain things which people are trying to purchase online now, which the company is saying this is not available in the UK. Because if you buy a pair of shoes and they come to you, you'll be asked to pay another £37.50 from the postman because that hasn't been sorted out. There are so many things in the coming few months where people are just going to go, oh, is that what it means? Is that what Brexit means? Because I think there's so much in campaigning for the Brexit vote which was sort of poetic, and now we're going to start seeing the cold, hard realities. I thought the government sort of dodged a bullet with the Scottish lorries which came down with, writing on the side of them. But I thought that was really going to, be more than what it ended up being. Because of lockdown, they got a fine for breaking coronavirus legislation and were sent off. But that is being felt in hundreds of businesses who just feel shy about talking up against Brexit because you do get attacked. But, and the other thing is, as you're all aware, the Brexit select committee in the Commons doesn't exist anymore. So the only way that we can really debate this and get to the bottom of it in a sort of technical way so that members can understand what is going on is through an urgent question and bringing Brandon Lewis or whichever Minister Michael Gove into the House of Commons. And, it was raised today at PMQs and it will not stop. It will continue. Every week you will have the DUP saying get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and you will have people whose constituents are affected standing up and saying to the Prime Minister, sort this out, get this done. So, you know, I feel that this is a very fraught issue, which will continue. And in terms of the geopolitics of it, depending on which way this debate goes, I could imagine Joe Biden saying, I really look at the UK and the island of Ireland, which of course he loves because of his Irish background. And I'm thinking, I don't want to go near a trade deal right now because it's all just too complicated. Whereas I think perhaps looking at the EU, the size of the EU, what it has on offer, and so on, at the moment, I think he'd probably be more likely to be, you know, approaching Brussels. And I'm sure Seb, Richard, and others know whether those approaches are being made or not, or whether things are still a bit quiet. Obviously, Mr. Biden's got a lot of domestic things on his agenda as well. You know, reforming the police for a start, and looking at the control of the far right, the rise of the far right there. But eventually he's going to start thinking about trade. And at that point, it'll be very interesting to see which way he goes. But I think that really means that the whole concept of the US trade deal, I think that's probably gone for now. I mean, I'm interested in what others know, because you'd all have different sources which you read, which you look at, different media. But my reading of it is that we are in such a kind of a fragile position if you combine COVID, the recession, Brexit, climate. I just can't see the UK-US trade deal being the top thing on the agenda. So all those promises made to people who voted for Brexit, that don't worry, because if we're doing 45% or 48% of our trade with the EU, don't worry, because that will all be replaced by the US. Personally, I don't see that happening straight away. It's a complex thing, which I think the US would be correct to steer away from.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, just a little bit of comeback on that. So I think, I mean, we know that in economic and trade terms, that a deal traded with the US would have negligible, but benefits the UK anyway. There's no way that it could replace a deal with the EU. Or of course, in narrative terms, the Conservatives would sell it as if it would. And then just to come back on the Northern Ireland Protocol, I mean, this is always going to be the weak point of the deal, because of the peace implications and because they've chosen to put a border, within our own territory as a country. I don't think any other country in the world has done that, because it's a ludicrous thing to do. And then, of course, given the EU's, admitted but also brief mistake last week over vaccines and our government's response to that, I don't know if you saw that today, Michael Gove has written to the EU a long letter, essentially blaming them for everything and saying that he wants, essentially key parts of the protocol kind of deferred for a long time, so to allow an easing of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so that we could send overcooked meats and soil and things like that we're not allowed to send, because we're sending them into the single market, which is of course to take a brief EU mistake over vaccines and to essentially use that as leverage to get them to change the protocol and blame them for the protocol, when of course the protocol was entirely Johnson and Gove's fault, because they chose to do it because they wanted to take Great Britain out of the single market and customs union. So, that is worrying in many ways, and makes me seriously question how long the protocol is sustainable, because if you've got both sides, well, not so much the EU actually, but certainly, GB now saying that they're going to, want to find ways to get around the protocol and are essentially threatening to use Article 16 to do it if the EU don't agree, it brings into question the survival of the protocol as a whole. I mean, Catherine, what do you, I guess just a blunt question, do you think the protocol is sustainable? And if not, what would the results be?
I think somebody earlier on in the chat asked about whether there was any possibility of rejoining the customs union, because of course that really was what the backstop proposal of Mrs. May was. And at the time, of course, those of us who wanted to, didn't vote for it because we felt that it wasn't what we wanted, but equally, it might be a solution. Now, I think at the moment, we won't be calling for it necessarily, because I think there are several steps to get to before you get to that position. But at a very technical level, something like that is required. I mean, the other thing is that at the moment we're very focused on goods and the customs union, but, the services element of our economy is being quite patient, but there are a number of issues which still need to be resolved in terms of services. The City of London has to have a number of matters resolved, and the Treasury will have to start meeting eventually to look at those issues. And of course, professional services, when people realise that their qualifications won't be recognised in different countries, when you need a separate visa for every country. I've put in to speak in the musicians' visas for the musicians debate next Monday, which is a petitions debate in the House of Commons, because musicians who have, 20 venues that they're singing at or they're playing at in the EU, there is no product there which they can just use. The other issue, of course, Mike, is the fact that the government is currently not recognising Jaude Almeida, who is the ambassador to the UK from the EU. And it's such an efficient arrangement to have one person who can do all the negotiations on your behalf. But at the moment, the government is saying, oh no, we want to have bilaterals. So everybody has a different embassy, thinking that they can buy countries off, not realising that it actually is in the UK's interest to have a go-to person who could help to resolve these matters. On my own website, I've got a letter writing to Dominic Raab to ask him to look at that again. But, I think we're just in the foothills of all this. But what really I think we need to focus on is peace in Northern Ireland. I mean, it was always, for me, the peace argument, whether it was post-1944 or whether it was peace in Northern Ireland, for me, on the left, that was always the big argument for being in the EU. And we don't need to scratch our heads and ask why. For 2 days, nobody has been able to work at LAN because of fear of violence. So, these are real things. And the idea that we can just assume that there'll be peace on this continent forever, and that this is just completely wrong. The rise of the far right in Eastern Europe. There's a number of worrying things happening in terms of the way refugees are being treated on the borders there. Whether that's, Montenegro, Bosnia, Hungary, certain things that the Polish government are saying. It's deeply worrying what we are going through at the moment. And it's just a terrible time to be leaving Europe, and we must make every effort to keep peace really very much at the forefront of all of our discussions.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, yeah. So David Taylor-Gubby, we'll come to you for your question, then we've got a question from Dan, and then we'll see where we go. Go ahead, David.
Thank you. I've listened to the debate, which was very interesting, very good. But am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are, yeah.
Right. I'm not quite sure what the policy is that we put forward. Is it that we're going to work in partnership with the EU on environmental issues, which I thought was what Seb was saying, and be part of their policy and sort of align ourselves with that? Or are we going to try and follow the Tories, which I posted as saying that they're going to do better than the European environmental policy? I'm writing an article about plastics pollution at the moment, and I looked up the plastics policy, and on the document published end of last year, they said they would abide by European standards and improve on them. So, there are two different sort of approaches that, we'll say, and then we'll agree with the Tories, we'll say we'll be better than EU as well. So I'm not quite sure what we actually say to the electorate. Do you follow the drift of my argument?
I do, absolutely, yes. Ruth, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I can do. I mean, in terms of the plastics, the government is saying that they will, for instance, in England, they will ban 3 different types of single-use plastics, and they've already said that they've indicated they will do this. The problem we have within the UK now is that, say, Wales wants to ban 9. Now, with the internal market bill, at the moment, we have the lowest common denominator. So we would not be able to ban 9 in Wales if there's only 3 banned in England. So we're falling backwards there. So what we don't want to do is good standards in, say, Scotland. We don't want to bring them down. We want to make sure we all go up. And I think that's one of the issues. In terms that somebody mentioned about the deposit return schemes, DRS, There is a scheme which is out for consultation, but again, we don't know the details. And again, the Environment Bill has been kicked into the long grass again. So we are going to struggle to get anything implemented before the end of 2021, which, you know, we left in December. We've got a whole year now where we've got regulations falling apart and we've got nothing to replace them.
So my actual question, sorry if I may, Chair, is that are we going to say to the electorate we want to work with the EU?
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk from my brief. So, for instance, with chemicals, it makes perfect sense to share the database. There's an EU database on chemicals. We could, and Theresa May said we should. We should be sharing that information. So I don't want to see any other animals tested unnecessarily or duplicate testing on animals for chemicals. It's completely out of line with anything in the Labour Party, our values. It's just not on. So what I want to say is that we should be sharing and there should be a way forward. Now, at the moment, there isn't, but hopefully in the future, again, you'd have to talk about negotiations, but we must have a simple way of sharing that sort of data. You know, I can only talk about that from my point of view. I can't talk. Catherine may well have other things she can talk about with her hat on, if you like.
Great, thank you, Ruth. Dan McCurry, we'll come to you.
Okay, hello. Yeah, my question was about the customs union. I think Catherine touched on it there, but I was motivated just to answer a question that Catherine actually asked, which was, will Biden want to do a trade deal? I'll just explain the economics of that, Catherine, is that no, he won't. Trade isn't an economic policy for the Americans, it's diplomatic. Because America is huge, they don't need the rest of the world. So tiny little Belgium sells chocolates in order to buy BMWs. They have to have trading partners because they're tiny. America is huge. They see world trade as a way of creating world peace. At the moment, Biden's got many other things to fix before he can start doing trade deals in order to make friends with people. But my question was, if it's really impossible now to go around saying, let's rejoin the EU. I know the name of this organisation, but we're all speaking out here. But if we went out there and said, let's try and persuade Keir Starmer to make a policy of rejoin the EU, they think we're insane right now. I mean, if I've accepted that, surely everyone has accepted it. What we can do is argue to rejoin the customs union, because every day you see problems with our borders. And I say customs union in particular because the single market is a separate thing. You cannot have a customs union if we're not also a member of the single market. But you could be in the single market but not be in the customs union. So you can dispose of that term and just talk about the customs union. Can we have free-flowing trade and people across borders? And I don't think the problems are going to go away. I think they're going to carry on and on and on. And I think on this point, I think we can persuade Keir Starmer, all these red wall seats, that this is a good policy, because it's no longer a cultural war. It's now an economic war. You only have to read The Sun and the Daily Mail and the Telegraph to see the stories are all about trade breaking down. It's an economic war. So I think we can enter that argument and campaign for Labour to have this policy. That's my view. I'd like to hear what MPs and MEPs think of that.
Who wants to respond to that?
Seb.
Seb?
Can I go? Sorry. First of all, Dan, you've taken the flag, the embrace of the flag there to heart. I like that. That is very strong flag action. Yeah, so I agree. For a start, we can't go around saying let's rejoin the EU, but we can say ultimately, we think we're better off in the EU. I mean, look, let's be honest. There's a difference between what we want and what we think is practical now to campaign on. And I'd actually go one step back. I don't think we can either campaign at the moment to re-enter the customs union or the single market. I think we have to be much more piecemeal than that and basically point out the problems that people are facing up and down the country, whether it be in relation to exports or whether it be in relation to their ability to perform as artists, whether it be in their ability to extend their professional services architects or lawyers, or all of the myriad of things that will start happening when people start traveling again, and those problems will become more apparent. We need to campaign on those specific individual aspects, and the rest will follow. But the problem that the Labour Party, I feel, has, and I feel a certain sense of freedom in now being able to say these things as a non-elected representative, is that, you know, the Labour Party is frightened at the moment of the B word, and that it's worried that in taking any of these specific issues on, it will immediately be cast in the same light that the Prime Minister did today at PMQs, for example, because, you know, the government is still very much, as Richard has pointed out in one of the comments he just made, the government is still very much fighting to protect Brexit, to justify Brexit, to all of the negative things are ignored, and any tiny grain of positivity, whether or not it's actually because of Brexit or whether or not it can be contrasted with the way things are happening in the rest of Europe, is being seized upon as an opportunity to justify. And we have to just accept that that is the campaigning environment we're in. But if we don't campaign on the specifics, then we have no voice when it comes to the particular sectors that are facing difficulties, or when it comes to the points with which we should be attacking the government further down the line. Because, as we all know, there will be aspects of this that are unignorable, that will fail. You cannot simply embed, as I said earlier, disadvantage into the system and then expect that to somehow work out and be okay. It won't be. People will lose their jobs because of this. People will be put at a disadvantage. Young people in Britain will be put at a disadvantage because of that. So we have to find a way of being able to use that and what this government is doing to this country as a form of attack later on. But it doesn't, I'm afraid, mean at the moment that any of us calling for a return to the single market of the customs union, even though we all know that's what we want. And actually, there's nothing wrong with even saying that one day we want to rejoin the EU. There's nothing wrong with saying that. It's not exactly a secret. Certainly for people like me or Richard, it's you know, it's not a secret. But, you know, we have to be very careful and considered about how we direct the campaigning now, because it's all far too easy for the Tories to just characterise Keir in a way that they frankly were desperate to from day one. But I think there's also a danger that Labour is taking us too far in the other direction. We have to be able to have that voice, and we have to be able to hold them to account for what they're doing. And unfortunately, if we ignore too much of what's happening, then it will be so much harder to do that when the opportunity arises.
Thank you, Seb. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I mean, I think you're right. And I think some of us do need to say that we think Britain's best future is in the European Union, even though we're not in the European Union, just as we say that the country's best future is under a Labour government and we haven't got one. You know, so people who say, yes, but we voted to leave, then so therefore we can never be in it again. Well, in less than 18 months ago, we voted for a Conservative government. That doesn't mean we need to live under a Conservative government forever. That isn't how democracy works. And so I think we need to make that argument in democratic terms, but also in just tangible terms of Brexit's making things worse, so we want to make things better. But you're right, Labour shouldn't come out for rejoining the European Union as a policy right now, and we do need to build back piecemeal. And I think that probably starts, as you were saying, I think it starts with musicians. Just one thing on the customs union, and I'll throw in, because I only learned this the other week, because I interviewed somebody. There's a campaign called DEFRA for UK, which is, as the name would suggest, suggesting that we rejoin, that we join EFTA rather as a route into the single market. And that would make things better, and it would make things better. But being a member of EFTA, as we know, doesn't include membership of the single market. And the person I was interviewing was telling me that the Conservatives, strangely, in my view, are much more favourable towards the single market than they are the customs union. They really hate the customs union, or a lot of them do anyway, because they really want to run an independent trade policy. So for the government and the Conservatives, actually joining the customs union will be more toxic than the single market, where I would imagine for public opinion, because the single market includes freedom of movement, the reverse would be the case. I would imagine the public could be fairly relaxed about the customs union, because they would think, like us, it's probably quite good if trucks can go back and forth, and we can have a reasonable trade, and we can do the same with Northern Ireland. So just throw that in. So I'll come up with a question though to Catherine. So the government narrative, I mean, clearly just the last few days and how they've reacted to the EU and vaccines and so on, they've essentially weaponized it against the European Union and the European Commission, and they'll continue to do that. So how do you think that we can best combat that, both as a party, but then also just as pro-Europeans more broadly?
Thanks, Mike. And I've got to go at 8:15, so it might be my last contribution. I just feel very strongly that we need to stick to what are the things that are going wrong, and as an MP and Ruth and so on, just that we drag them to the House of Commons to have to explain every single day. So every single week, at least, there's been something which they've had to explain. Often it's every day. So, for example, they promised to keep up with certain of the environmental protections, but they've just allowed pesticides to be used in that amendment where they failed to support the Labor amendment, which would protect pollinators. So that's a promise that they've broken already. And then peace in Northern Ireland, they've really broken that promise, because we're seeing people who are too afraid to go to work as border staff or people who work in Larne. And then in terms of tariff-free and frictionless trade, if you want to purchase a particular item, but it happens to be made in Europe, you have to pay an extra charge. You know, that to me, a charge or a tariff, there's not a lot of difference between a charge and a tariff. So I think that every single day there will be more things. And right now, I think the position has to be for us to hold them to account, to bring them to the House of Commons to explain. And I feel what's going to happen, it's quite slow, it's quite incremental, but in a few months' time, the general feeling of decline, when you combine the triple whammy of, you know, COVID and the recession and Brexit, it will just start feeling like a real sense of decline and going backwards. And I think right now, what we're doing in the Labour Party is really just to question and to hold to account. But once we get our National Policy Forum sort of scaffolding up and ready by the summer, Labour Party conference will be starting to debate policies, and we'll be starting to look at what do we say to the electorate. And at that point, we need to start laying that out. As Shadow Europe Minister, I have no problem in saying that we want a close relationship with Europe. Apart from anything, a close relationship with Europe is much more straightforward than, say, you know, a close relationship with China, and even with the US. If we wanted to do the trade deal with them and they wanted to do a trade deal with us, that's deeply problematic around our agriculture sector. So I feel saying that we want to have a close relationship with Europe is a good way of putting it. The actual fine detail on that, whether it's talking about some kind of looking like a Switzerland or a Norway approach or other things, I think that can come a bit later, but just expressing. And if you read Keir's speech to the Fabian conference, he's very strong on multilateralism. He wants us to be back in New York talking about, you know, reducing arms. You'd be aware that the New START treaty has now suddenly been extended for 5 years because Biden has managed to reach out and get that back onto the table for another 5 years. There's a lot of positive things that have happened since Biden came in. We need to be looking carefully at how he won that election, because it was actually very close, but it wasn't through falling into traps. And a lot of people on the call tonight have talked about the trap of falling into saying, you know, talking about Brexit in a particular way, which looks to all intents and purposes though we've fallen into a trap. But I don't think there's anything wrong with saying we want a close relationship with Europe, that our values are European values, that we have a proud history and tradition, that we want to work together, and that European partners are the safest in terms of other global partners, and that together, working on the problems that the world presents geopolitically, Europe is obviously, you know, our closest partnerships. And I think that will set us apart from the Tories, because this CPTPP proposal to, you know, start thinking about more national security assets in the Pacific and all this sort of thing. You know, I think that there's a very, very important discussion to be had about that. And as somebody who's got a master's in Chinese studies, and I know China had that brief as well before in 2015 to 17, it's incredibly important. But on a day-to-day basis, we are in the continent of Europe, and we need to get on really well with our partners. and we need to get that relationship back onto an even keel. And I would imagine by the time the general election comes round, there will have been so many confected rows that I suspect a lot of people will want that noise to go away. And also I think they're going to want to see other faces on their television screens, not just Mr. Gove and Mr. Johnson.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. That's a hopeful way to bid farewell to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We've got further events with Catherine coming up in future weeks, over the next few weeks. So do look out for details of those. So we'll finish up by 8:15-ish. So we're almost there. But Ruth, Seb, can I come to final comments from you? And I guess just your final words to the attendees, and maybe a word of hope for us before we head off.
Well, there's always hope, always hope. I mean, yeah, I just very briefly, I mean, in terms of, I don't see it as a choice, by the way, between whether or not we work with the EU or push for higher standards. I mean, one of the things obviously we did as MEPs was always push for the highest possible standards. And I don't say that glibly, I mean it, because we had long passed the point where there was a conflict in what we did between economic growth and being environmentalists. So that was a conflict that existed for a long time, I think, on the left, but by the time I was an MEP, certainly we've moved beyond that. We consistently called for the highest possible targets on CO2 emissions, on vehicle emissions, on air quality standards, and so on. And that's what we should continue to do. But what I meant, I suppose, in my comments is that we have to recognize that the structures of the European Union are there not just to serve its member states, but actually to serve as a blueprint for others as well, and that we shouldn't disregard them as a result. And the very last thing we should do, of course, is to let our guard down if indeed that Tory Brexiteer aim of a race to the bottom, which of course many have that as a goal on a series of issues. They want a freer state that has less regulation, that is, you know, more nimble and all the rest of it. The subtext of that, of course, is weaker standards and a worse environmental record. We must never let our guard down on that, but there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be calling for stronger standards than the EU on a whole range of things. And in terms of the hope, look, we've talked about a number of the issues that people are facing up and down the country. They're not ignorable. You can ignore them for a certain amount of time, for sure. You can even kind of persuade people that their concerns are temporary, as of course the government is trying to do by describing things as teething problems and by coming up with short-term grants to some businesses in order to stave off the worst effects. But you can only do that for so long. There will come a point when the aggregate effect is completely unignorable. And of course, as I said, that entrenched disadvantage that the UK will be put at is something that is unsustainable in a developed democracy where people have access to information and the ability to speak their mind, which of course we do. So that's my hope. It's been a tough couple of weeks, no question. But, you know, the government is very good at seizing on the tiniest thread and pulling very hard at it if it perceives it to be in its interest. That's why the Labour Party needs to not only be wise to that, but obviously have the ability to push back on Brexit, even if we don't mention the word Brexit. And that's really where my plea would be. So combine that hope that we have, the status of Brexit as something whose flaws will inevitably be uncovered, but also a plea to the Labour Party to actively uncover them, because it's in that uncovering that I think a huge opportunity lies for the party.
Brilliant. Thank you, Seb, and I agree with every word. Ruth, final word from you, please.
Just be very quick. I mean, looking at it logically, the EU is our nearest neighbour, so it makes sense. You want to get on with your neighbours, and that's exactly what we want to do. They're the people we've traded with for hundreds of years. You know, we ain't going to change that overnight. And in terms of looking at climate change, we want to mitigate travel and transportation costs and fuel and emissions, so it makes sense that we continue to trade with them. You know, a deal with New Zealand is a very small beer for our lambs, if you like. And do they want our lambs, you know, when they've got their own? These are big issues, I think, which we need to focus on the fact that the EU is there. It's a massive population for our trade. And, you know, in terms of logistics, environment, and economics, we need to be trading with them. And we must keep on, you know, as Catherine said, that's the logical thing to do there. And I think the one ray of hope is in the treaty, because I have read it, any divergence from the treaty will be met with resistance. And I think that's where we need to make sure we keep talking to our European allies to make sure that we do maintain our standards, and, you know, divergence is not an option.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ruth and Catherine and Seb, for joining us this evening. It's honestly been brilliant to have you here, and a real privilege. So thank you very much for your time. We'll be back fairly soon with another event with Catherine. And I think we've got an event next Monday as well, though I'm not entirely sure what that's on, but that's my fault. But I think there's one happening Monday at 6 o'clock. So we'll see you then for a mysterious event. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining, everybody. Been great to have you here, and we know we're heading in the right direction, and we know we're heading in the side of right as well. And I firmly believe that public opinion is beginning to be with us and will be with us more in future. I mean, was encouraged the other day. I saw some polling that said that 48% of people thought that leaving the European Union was a bad idea, and only 40% thought it was a good idea. That's different, of course, from a majority of people saying we want to rejoin now, but it's definitely something that we can be positive about. And actually, if the same numbers were reported in terms of Scottish independence, everybody would be saying it's inevitable. Because with Scottish independence, everybody's got to the point of thinking that similar numbers actually mean that it's inevitable, but somehow the narratives are we're never going to join the European Union. And as much as anything, this is just about the media narrative in February 2021, but it won't stay that way. And we need to be part of making sure that it doesn't stay that way, and B, that we get a Labour government and that we get back into the European Union as soon as we can. So on that note, we'll finish off. Thank you so much for joining, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.